The winds howled through the remnants of what was once a thriving city, the ancient stones of its buildings now broken and weathered. The air smelled of earth and ash, tinged with the sharp, metallic scent of battle. It had been years since the alien fleets descended, wiping out most of humanity's strongest forces. Yet the survivors, those still clinging to life, fought on. Jack Blackwood stood alone at the edge of a crumbled highway, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His rugged features, sun-scorched from months of exposure, were set in determination. A lone wolf in a world that no longer understood the meaning of peace, Jack had learned to trust no one. His loyalty had been torn apart in the early days of the invasion, and since then, his survival instincts had been all that kept him alive. It was in this desolate world that he first heard her, a faint rustling in the underbrush, like a whisper on the wind. He paused, narrowing his eyes. His hand instinctively went to the weapon strapped to his side, fingers brushing the worn grip of the plasma rifle. Jack had fought many battles, but this felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension. Then she appeared. A figure darted from the shadows, a woman, but not entirely. Her lithe form moved with the fluidity of a predator, and her glowing eyes reflected the faint light of the dying sun. She was small, barely taller than his shoulder, but there was an undeniable force around her. Her skin shimmered like polished metal, with shades of purple and silver shifting as she moved. And the way she stood, confident and unyielding, made Jack's blood run cold. "Who are you?" Jack's voice was steady, but his heart beat faster. His instincts screamed at him to run, but curiosity held him in place. There was something about her, something that didn't belong, yet demanded his attention. Her lips curled into a slight smile, but her gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking. "A warrior," she said, her voice soft but laced with power. Her accent was unfamiliar, but there was an edge to her words, something dangerous. Jack took a step back, but she was already in front of him, faster than he had anticipated. She was tiny, but there was a fierce strength in her eyes that made him second-guess every move he made. His hand tightened around his rifle, but before he could aim, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared. He cursed under his breath and dropped his weapon, instincts telling him that she wasn't an immediate threat. Yet, his curiosity was unbearable. What was she doing here? Why hadn't she attacked? Why had she let him live? "Stay on guard," he muttered to himself, scanning the area. He moved cautiously forward, eyes darting to every rustle and shadow. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. Minutes passed before he saw her again. But this time, she wasn't alone. From the trees, a larger, more menacing figure emerged, a hulking, armored beast, its eyes glowing in the dim light. The alien skin was like dark stone, craggy and rough, and its massive form towered over Jack by several feet. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was a warrior, not like the human survivors who fought for scraps, but a true, formidable enemy. The small woman was standing in front of the creature, holding her ground, her stance unwavering. Jack instinctively stepped back, hand reaching for his rifle once more. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was a test of survival. "What do you want?" Jack shouted, trying to mask his uncertainty with bravado. The woman's glowing eyes flicked over to him, and for the first time, Jack saw a glimmer of something, fear perhaps. It was gone in a second, replaced by the same resolute calm she had carried before. "You," she said simply, as if the word alone explained everything. "You're in my way." Before Jack could react, the alien lunged forward, its enormous fist swinging with terrifying force. Jack barely had time to raise his rifle before the creature collided with him, sending him crashing into the ground. The air was knocked out of him, but his instincts kicked in. He fought back, struggling to bring his rifle to bear, but the creature was too powerful. The small woman, Lyra, he realized, was already moving, her speed and agility something he couldn't have imagined. She darted around the creature's enormous form, leaping onto its back with the precision of a predator. Her hands moved with deadly intent, finding weak spots in the alien's armor as she struck. Jack watched in stunned disbelief. Get up! Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. You're not dead yet, human! He gritted his teeth, pushing himself up as she fought. The alien roared and raged, but Lyra's attacks were relentless. She had a way of moving, swift, efficient, and terrifyingly skilled. This wasn't some lone survivor with a weapon, this was a warrior of another world, and for a fleeting moment, Jack felt a pang of awe. Help me! She called, her voice breaking through his daze. Jack didn't hesitate. He surged forward, charging the alien with all the fury he could muster. Together they fought, human and alien, the unlikely pair driven by sheer necessity. When it was over, the alien crumpled to the ground, its massive form now motionless. Lyra stood over it, panting heavily, her body bruised but unbroken. Jack's heart was still racing, but it wasn't from the fight. For the first time since the war had begun, he realized something. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. Something else, something he couldn't yet name, had begun to stir between him and this alien warrior. It was a strange, unwelcome feeling, one that would only grow in the days to come. Nice work, Jack muttered, his voice low. He didn't know whether he meant it for her skill or for the fact that, against all odds, they had survived. She smiled, a real smile this time, her eyes flickering with something deeper, something more dangerous. You're welcome, she replied, but Jack didn't miss the underlying challenge in her tone. This was only the beginning. And neither of them knew where it would lead. The night had fallen heavy, cloaking the world in darkness. The wreckage of the old city sprawled beneath the blackened sky, like a forgotten monument to humanity's failures. Jack sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting fleeting shadows on his face. His eyes were tired, but his mind was alert. It had been a long day, longer than any he'd experienced since the invasion, but his body wouldn't let him rest. His muscles ached from the fight, but his thoughts were still consumed by Lyra. She had saved his life. Jack's gaze flickered to the small form of the alien warrior, sitting a few feet away, her back against the crumbled wall. Her silhouette was barely visible in the low light, but he knew she was awake. Lyra always seemed to be awake. She hadn't spoken much since the fight, and Jack could sense the walls she'd erected around herself. It wasn't just the alien blood coursing through her veins, it was something deeper, something guarded. She wasn't human, yet somehow she was more than human. I didn't think I'd find another fighter out here, Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but direct, testing the waters between them. Lyra's glowing eyes shifted toward him, and for a moment, Jack felt a spark of connection. But it was fleeting, quickly masked by the cold exterior she wore so well. Fighters are a rarity these days, she replied, her voice smooth but edged with an unspoken weariness. I don't fight for the same reasons you do. Jack raised an eyebrow. And what's that supposed to mean? Lyra didn't answer immediately. She shifted, her movements fluid and deliberate, like a cat considering its next move. You fight for survival, she said finally, her voice softer now, almost contemplative. I fight because I have no choice. Jack didn't respond right away. There was something in her words, something that struck a chord deep inside him. He understood the feeling, fighting simply because the world left you no other option, but it was different for her. Her words hung in the air, heavy with a past that Jack couldn't begin to comprehend. Why are you here? Jack asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Lyra's gaze shifted, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something more than just battle-hardened resolve in her eyes, doubt. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to make Jack's heart race. There was more to her than she was willing to admit. More to her than she was showing. You wouldn't understand, she said quietly, almost to herself. Then, after a pause, she added, I've seen too much. I've lost too much. Jack's fingers flexed, the firelight reflecting off the worn metal of his rifle. His instincts told him to push, to dig deeper, to break down the walls she'd so carefully constructed around herself. But something held him back. She had saved his life, and that meant something. It had to mean something. You've been running from them, haven't you? Jack asked, his voice softer now, almost like a confession. The ones that attacked us. Lyra turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto his. Her expression was unreadable, but Jack could feel the weight of her gaze. I don't run, she said, her voice sharp, but her words carried an undercurrent of something darker. I survive. The tension between them thickened, the crackling fire the only sound in the silence that followed. Jack knew she was right. He couldn't understand her struggle. He couldn't even fathom the battles she'd fought, the wars that had torn her people apart. But that didn't mean he couldn't try. That didn't mean he couldn't help. I don't know what you're running from, Lyra, Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. But I'm not going anywhere. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For the briefest moment, Lyra looked at him like she was about to say something, anything, but the moment passed. She didn't. Instead, she rose to her feet, the fluid motion so graceful that it felt like the air itself bent to her will. She walked toward the edge of their temporary camp, her back straight, shoulders tense, the unmistakable aura of someone who had been betrayed too many times to trust anyone fully. Jack watched her go, a part of him aching with the realization that the wall she had built around herself wasn't something he could easily tear down. But he wasn't going to give up. Not yet. He stood, stretching his arms as the firelight flickered and danced. The night was cold, but there was something else in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't alone. Not just because of Lyra. The sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside their camp reached his ears, sharp and deliberate. Jack's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but before he could react, a voice called out from the darkness. You're not the only one who's been watching. Jack's heart raced. It was a voice he hadn't heard before, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. Someone, or something, was out there. And they weren't alone anymore. Lyra had heard it too. She turned sharply, her hand already resting on the hilt of the blade she kept at her side. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of violence and betrayal. A new enemy? Or something more dangerous? You're not the only one who's been watching, the voice repeated, and Jack knew in that moment that everything was about to change. And they were no longer just fighting for survival. Now they were fighting for each other. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale silver beams over the ruined city. The remnants of humanity's past, broken, abandoned, sprawled out before Jack, the wind carrying whispers of what had been. He sat near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into his bones, but it did little to soothe the storm brewing inside him. After the chaos of the day, after the fight, he thought he would be able to rest. But sleep evaded him. His thoughts were consumed by Lyra, by the fierce, enigmatic alien warrior who had changed everything. She had saved him, but it wasn't just her skill that left an impression. It was the way she fought, not out of fear or anger, but out of pure necessity. She was a survivor, driven by something deeper, something he couldn't yet understand. It was that same fire that made her so dangerous, but also something more. Something he felt deep down, but couldn't yet put into words. The fire crackled, snapping Jack from his thoughts. He looked over at her, her silhouette half hidden in the darkness, eyes glowing faintly. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her posture rigid, a warrior at rest but never fully relaxed. Jack knew that she, like him, was always waiting for the next danger, the next fight. But tonight something was different. Lyra! Jack's voice cut through the stillness, barely above a whisper, but loud enough to reach her. You've been quiet. I thought we'd at least talk after everything. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze didn't move, but Jack could feel her attention on him, as if she was calculating something. He was used to the quiet, the silence that stretched out between him and others, but with her, it felt heavier. It was more than just the absence of sound. It was the weight of two souls colliding, unsure how to bridge the divide. Finally she spoke, her voice low, carrying a sense of unease. What is it you want to know, human? Jack couldn't help but feel a rush of frustration. Her words were always measured, her emotions always guarded. It wasn't a wall, no, it was a fortress. But tonight, Jack wasn't going to let it stand. He had seen enough to know that Lyra wasn't just some alien warrior. She had a story, one he wanted to understand. "Why are you here?" Jack asked, his voice steadier this time. "You don't belong in this world. You don't belong in this fight. You could be out there, somewhere, away from all this chaos. So why stay?" Lyra's head tilted slightly, her eyes narrowing as if weighing the question, as if deciding whether or not to grant him the privilege of an answer. "You wouldn't understand," she said again, her tone tinged with frustration. "No one ever does." Jack moved closer, his body instinctively drawn to hers, as if the gravity between them was more than just the physical distance. "Try me," he said softly. His words were simple, but the underlying sincerity was undeniable. "We've fought side by side. You've trusted me with your life, and now I'm asking you to trust me with your story." She was silent for a long time. The tension between them thickened, as if the very air around them had become dense with unspoken words. Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't know what he was hoping for, but something told him this was the moment, a fragile one, yet powerful. Finally, Lyra sighed, her breath escaping in a soft rush. "I'm not like you," she said, her words carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I come from a planet far away, one that's been torn apart by war. My people, they were powerful once, but we were betrayed, and now we are nothing. Just fragments of what we used to be." Jack listened intently, every word cutting through the silence like a blade. He could see the pain in her eyes now, the cracks in the armor she wore so well. "Betrayed? By who?" Lyra shook her head, her eyes downcast. "I'm not sure anymore. But it doesn't matter. They're gone, and I'm still here, alone." She looked up at him then, her gaze hardening. "And I will stay alone. It's the only way to survive." Jack's chest tightened as he took in her words. Her pain wasn't just something she had to endure, it was a part of her, woven into every fiber of her being. She had been broken by loss, shaped by a past she couldn't escape. And yet here she was, still standing, still fighting. "I get it," Jack said, his voice rough but steady. "I've lost people too. People who were everything to me. And I've been fighting ever since, just trying to hold on to whatever's left." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "But you don't have to be alone." Lyra's gaze flickered, a brief flash of something, fear, hope, confusion, before it disappeared. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the weight of his words. "I don't need your pity, human," she said coldly, but Jack could hear the tremor in her voice. "I don't need anyone. I'm not offering pity," Jack replied, his tone soft but firm. "I'm offering something else. Maybe we both need it, someone who understands." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jack could feel the pull between them, the magnetic force that neither of them could deny. Her walls were cracking, just slightly, but enough for Jack to see a glimpse of the person beneath the warrior. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whether he should pull back or push forward. A noise in the distance shattered the fragile moment. Jack's senses snapped to attention, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Lyra was already on her feet, poised for action. "Stay alert," she murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We're not alone." Before Jack could ask what she meant, the sound of footsteps, sharp and deliberate, echoed through the stillness. Jack's heart raced. And for the second time in one night, everything changed. The night was colder than it had been in days, the wind sweeping through the wreckage of the old city with an eerie howling that seemed to echo Jack's thoughts. The fire crackled weakly, its warmth doing little to dispel the tension that hung heavy in the air. Jack stood at the edge of their camp, scanning the shadows beyond the flickering light, senses sharpened, every muscle coiled. Lyra, always alert, was beside him. Her posture was rigid, her alien senses attuned to the faintest sounds, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. The subtle glow of her eyes illuminated her face, but it was her silence that spoke louder than words. She had been through this before, too many times, perhaps. But Jack knew the rules now. In this world, silence often meant danger. I don't like this, he muttered, eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkened cityscape. Whoever's out there is waiting. And they're not moving like the others. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed, sharp and calculating. She knew the stakes, understood the fragility of this world more than anyone he met. Her life had been shaped by loss, and she knew better than to trust anyone or anything. They're not here for us, Lyra finally said, her voice low and steady. They're here for something else. The words hit Jack like a stone, cold and heavy. What do you mean? He asked, but even as he spoke, his gut twisted. The tension in the air was thick with anticipation, and the unknown loomed just beyond their reach. Lyra's eyes flicked to him, an unreadable expression in them. I don't know. But I don't like it. We need to leave. Before Jack could respond, a sharp, metallic noise broke through the silence. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The sound reverberated through the still night air, each step punctuating the rising dread that churned inside him. Lyra moved swiftly, positioning herself between Jack and the approaching danger. Jack's breath caught in his chest. His pulse raced as the figure materialized out of the shadows, tall, armored, and unmistakably alien. The light from the fire glinted off its obsidian armor, its form imposing and deadly. Jack's hand went to his weapon, his fingers tightening around the grip of his plasma rifle. Lyra didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her hand held out in a gesture that was both commanding and cautionary. You don't belong here, she called out, her voice sharp, echoing in the empty space between them. The figure paused, studying her. Jack could see the flicker of recognition in Lyra's eyes. This wasn't just any random enemy, this was someone, or something, she knew. The tension in the air shifted, from uncertainty to something else, something more personal. Lyra! The voice came, deep and resonant, full of an ancient authority. It sent a chill down Jack's spine. You should not be here. You are a traitor to your own kind. Jack's grip tightened on his weapon, but Lyra remained still, unflinching. The quiet confidence in her stance was unnerving. She wasn't afraid. But there was something else in her eyes, something raw. Anger? Regret? It was hard to tell. I'm not your pawn anymore, she said, her voice cold, devoid of the compassion she had shown Jack earlier. You've taken enough from me. The figure took another step forward, its armor creaking as if responding to the tension in the air. You think you can run forever? The voice was a mixture of scorn and disappointment. You'll come back, or we will end you, Lyra. You are not free. You never will be. Jack's mind raced. The words felt like they carried more weight than just a threat. There was history here, something dark, something Lyra had left behind. And whatever it was coming for her, for them both. He couldn't let this continue. Stepping forward, Jack spoke, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. She's not going anywhere. And neither are you. The alien's gaze shifted to him, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. Another human, it said, a mix of disdain and curiosity in its tone. You think you can protect her? You know nothing of what you're dealing with. Jack squared his shoulders, his pulse thundering in his ears. I don't care what she's done. What matters is that she's here now. And you're not taking her anywhere. For a long moment neither moved. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the vast, empty expanse of the ruined city. Lyra's gaze flickered between Jack and the alien, her expression unreadable. Get out of our way, she said, her voice low but filled with resolve. The alien's eyes narrowed, a slow, calculated smirk spreading across its face. Very well, it said, its voice a promise of things to come. But remember, Lyra, this isn't over. You're never truly safe. Not anymore. With that, the alien stepped back into the shadows, its massive form disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Jack stood frozen, the tension in his body not yet fading. He turned to Lyra, his heart still racing, his mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice tight with the aftermath of the confrontation. Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze distant as she stared into the fire. "A ghost from my past," she replied softly. "And the one thing I can never outrun." Jack's throat tightened. He could feel the weight of her words, the weight of everything she had been carrying on her shoulders. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. For the first time, the stakes felt real, too real. And the night, which had promised only darkness, now held an uncertain future. Lyra's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, they were no longer just two warriors in a ruined world. They were two people, standing side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. But would they survive it? That was the question. And it lingered unanswered in the heavy air between them.